Hello! Today we're going to talk about rendering, and I will show you how I colored and rendered this illustration I recently made. Let's start out with the flat colors. This first step is very simple but important because it's where you get to decide the color story for your piece. I don't really have one set kind of palette that I always come back to. I've been enjoying experimenting with that, but I noticed myself often gravitating towards relatively low contrast colors that look soft and cohesive. One difficulty that arises with this kind of palette though is keeping enough contrast so that the illustration doesn't look washed out or details become illegible. But we will talk more about that later in this video. For this illustration, my main two colors are this bright lime green and a flamingo pink. These colors are supported by muted gray and lavender tones, as well as some slight variations of the main colors that can be found throughout the piece and just help balance out the two main colors. Generally, I believe it's a good idea to limit your palette to just 2 to 3 main colors that define the look of your illustration and building the supporting colors around that. It helps you create something that looks intentional and focused while preventing the process from becoming too overwhelming and making your piece look cluttered and confused. Of course, there are ways to implement a lot of colors into your illustration, but I think it's good to at least start out with some focal points. You can absolutely plan your colors beforehand and test different color combinations using thumbnails or drawing out little test palettes to see how specific colors interact with each other. But personally, I tend to decide which colors I want to use on the fly. I'm not always sure if that's a good or a bad thing necessarily, but I tend to just follow my intuition and choose colors that feel right in the moment, while sticking to the general principles I talked about before. But I feel like this quote-unquote intuition is something that has developed over time with practice, so if you are having trouble with picking your colors, just take your time and play around as much as you need until you find something that works. Moving right along to the next step of adding subtle blush and shading. For the skin in particular, I usually add some around the eyes, ears, and the joints. I like thinking about how ball-jointed dolls are often blushed by doll artists. Anywhere you find a joint is usually a good place to apply color to the skin to make the figure look more alive. And because the characters in this illustration are supposed to appear quite playful and doll-like, this approach actually works quite well for the look I'm trying to achieve. I'm not really trying to make anything very realistic or super three-dimensional looking here, but I'm rather following the less is more principle. So to keep things looking soft, there is no directly discernible harsh light source present in this illustration. There's light coming both shining down from the top as well as from their surroundings, which is creating some soft shadows on their faces and necks as well as their clothing. I am honestly not super analytical with this, and I could definitely do a better job with placing my shadows here, but in the context of this illustration, I believe it's not too distracting, even if they are a bit nonsensical. If you do have a very specific lighting situation in mind, of course getting a reference to help you out is always a good idea. Now, when it comes to picking the colors of my shadows, I like using a darker, slightly more saturated version of the base color, as well as working in some of the purple that I'm using as my third main color here. If you're simply going darker and not adding more saturation to the color, you often run the risk of making your drawing just appear muddy. I also like adding slight color variations around the edges of my larger shadows, like the neck or on the top, for example, which adds some extra dimension to the drawing. I also soften some of the edges of my shadows here because I don't want them to look too harsh and just appear more natural, since there is light coming from multiple places around the piece. And this concludes the preparation stage of laying down our colors and making sure we know where everything should go. And at this point in the process, I usually begin painting on top of everything we just did. You might have noticed that I did not do any line art and just used my sketch as a starting point for coloring. And that is because I approach most of my digital illustrations in a more quote-unquote traditional drawing sense of working upwards from the base, building up details and rendering by adding things on top. I begin by cleaning up bits that are not clearly defined by the sketch and add line work in places that I feel need it. This is also where building some additional contrast comes in. Like I mentioned, I was aiming for a soft color palette with minimal contrast here, and to stay true to this idea without having details melt into each other, I like using a darker version of a surrounding color and drawing outlines around things like the earrings, the pimple patches, and filling in the outgrown roots of the hair, like in a more solid, darker tone to add additional contrast. I like using a variety of colors for this step because it makes things look cohesive and kind of prevents these lines from reading as very clean and strict line art. Of course, this is just my personal preference. I like keeping certain parts of these illustrations sketchy to preserve the character of the initial drawing, But I think this method can absolutely also be applied to a more classic line art approach where you can color match and try to really make your line work a part of the colors that you already established. With most of the cleanup work done, it's time to add a little bit more fun detail, highlights, and really polishing up certain bits. As you saw, I added some eye shines and little highlights to their lips, like they're using lip gloss or something. And I really like playing around with these. Their eye shines have each other's opposite color in them, so the green girl has pink eye shines and the pink girl has green eye shines. And I'm continuing to add even more depth to certain areas. I think the rendering stage never truly ends. You could take this really far and I don't know, I feel like an illustration is never truly finished. You just like abandon it at one point. Like you just decide that this is it, I'm done, we're leaving it at this stage. So yeah, you can just take it as far as you feel like you need to. There is one point of this illustration, however, that I actually ended up changing quite drastically because I felt like I really didn't do a great job of sketching the left girl's hand with the sticker sheet she's holding for the patches. It just looks very off and I didn't put a lot of effort into it, clearly. So I redrew it and instead of going back and like erasing things I'd done, I actually just paint on top of it on a new layer. So if you don't need your like separate clean layers, like just color, just line work, just like details and rendering on top, and it doesn't really matter how your layers look, then you can definitely paint on top for something like this. This may not be the most professional way to do things, but for the purpose of just like an illustration like this, I think it works totally fine. So I can recommend trying it out if you want to do a more painterly approach. I kind of like how doing this feels because it feels more like an in-between of working digitally and traditionally. It doesn't feel so like hard and calculated, I guess. So yeah, I personally quite enjoy that. Another thing you can see me doing here is adding a like darker outline around the characters, like kind of going all the way around, and I think this really helps pull them away from the background a little bit. This isn't something I do all the time, but in the case of this illustration, I feel like it worked quite well, especially with the lighter background, just adding a little bit of additional separation and contrast. It seems a little bit more poster 2D illustration-like, I guess. I'm not sure how to describe it, but you can see for yourself. That's one of the final steps of this illustration, actually. Now it's really just a matter of adding more details, adding a little bit more color variation, cleaning up a little more here and there where I feel like it, like I mentioned, this rendering process of adding your final details and really touching things up to become what you want it to be is something that is very subjective, like when you decide to call it finished, I guess. I do sometimes actually return to illustrations like a week, 2 weeks, or even like half a year later, and then I see more things that I'm like, oh, maybe I would have actually added something here or changed something here. So I will sometimes add things later on with like a fresh eye, because if you work on something for so long in like 1 or 2 sittings, then sometimes you stop seeing certain things or details that would be worth considering, you know, adding something to or improving upon. So another, I guess, recommendation for your process that I can give you is maybe if you can afford to do so, take a little bit of time and space away from your drawing and then come back later and see if you maybe missed something. And that about wraps it up for my digital drawing or rendering process. I hope you guys found this helpful in some way. It's been a very long time since I've attempted to make something like a tutorial, though I don't really see this as a tutorial video. It's more like me showing you how I do it, and You can take away from it whatever you find useful. At the end of the day, a drawing process or an approach to how you create your illustrations is something very personal, and everyone ends up developing their own kind of habits, techniques, and things that help them achieve the kind of look or make the illustrations that they want to make. It's just a very individual thing, and this is how I did it. So this is the final illustration. I added a little bit of type, or I guess hand lettering here to finish it off, and it looks like a cute little poster now. I'm very happy with it. Thank you guys for joining me today, and happy drawing! See you again very soon. Bye bye!